Welcome to video 5, part 5 of the installment of the Armenian series. I am Jimmy Smith. Welcome along. And this is all about wine education to really enjoy the world of wine more. We are looking at a 6-part series here on Armenia. We're here going into the nitty-gritty of viticulture and winemaking, and a rather long session talking about karas, the wonderful clay pots in play in Armenia. If you have a comment or question, perhaps you've seen the karas or kavevri that you find, or churi that you find in Georgia, or you've tried wines from other parts of the world that utilize the clay pots from this part of the world, then get in touch, share your experience. What do you think about Armenian wine? Have you tried it before? It would be great to hear from you. Okay, let's talk about viticulture to begin with. So, traditional Armenian viticulture has evolved under quite tough conditions. That is, first of all, to do with the climate, for example, so high altitudes, intense sunlight, and limited water supply in some regions. So, vine training needed to be pragmatic. It needed to be something which was really useful for the grape grower. The classic method was the bush vine, known as the head-trained or gobelet vines. Here, the vine, as you probably have known from some of your studies, is kept low to the ground with no support, no trellising or posts, for example. You've got a picture there of an old vine in Vayots Dzor, for example. Now, each winter, growers prune the vine back to a few short spurs. These are little spurs that are jutting out with buds on them, and that creates a goblet-like shape. It's a very old methodology of pruning, and it has several advantages in Armenia. And you'll see these old vines in play if you visit places like the Vayots Dzor region, for example. Now, being close to the soil, grapes can benefit from warmth radiating off the ground during cold nights, which can help ripening. And the low center of gravity also helps the vines resist strong winds that can whip through the mountain valleys. And without a trellis, bush vines are naturally self-shading, protecting grape bunches from excessive sunburn in the very hot summers. It's also much more manageable, so you don't have to have the outlay of purchasing all of this expensive trellising and posting equipment. So it's letting the vine almost be fairly wild. Now, these techniques were passed down through generations of villagers being viticulturalists. And even today, if you visit remote vineyards like in Vayots Dzor or also in Aragat-Sotten, you'll find gnarly vines like this picture sprawled on some bushes, and they can be around 100 years or even more. And what else can we tell you? Well, a very impressive fact is that many of these, or at least some of them, are found on their own roots. Phylloxera hasn't reached all of these isolated places high on mountains in quite dramatically climatic areas. So they're often grown in a mishmash called a field blend. Multiple grape varieties mixed together, making a field blend of whatever is in that location. It's not about single varietal production, but actually about just making a wine from a plot. These old plots, though low yielding and are not structured by modern standards, are actually a rather treasure trove of genetic diversity and heritage, something that Wines of Armenia are now focusing on, certainly, to investigate clonal diversity, distinctive grape varieties which don't have much airtime or plantation yet. Though, sadly, it wasn't so easy because of political instability, and certainly in the Soviet era, There were problems, but villagers got on to their own methods, quietly continuing tending to these bush vineyards in the hills as they had for centuries, preserving the traditional practices which in other parts of Armenia for other produce were being eradicated by the Soviet regime. And that's really focusing on centralization in industrial farms, for example. Now, the humble bush vine approach really laid the foundations for Armenian viticulture. It's low tech but well suited to the local terroir, and it's enjoying a renewed appreciation around the world, not only just in Armenia, but with the Old Bush Vine Conference, for example, the Old Vine Conference, and others around the world. But of course, there is a modernization as well. And in the 1940s to the 1980s, viticulture in Armenia, due to the Soviet influence, became much more industrialized. The central authorities were very much hell bent on maximizing grape output, mostly for, of course, Armenian cognac brandy production. So they introduced modern trellising systems to the big state-run vineyards. Traditional bush vines that we were just talking about, found in those areas, were just uprooted. These old, almost kind of architecturally cathedral-like vines, sadly, were uprooted. And in their place, vineyards were laid out in orderly rows, mono-viticulture, with each vine trained along tensioned wires stretched between stakes. That's our trellising system. Now, this is very similar to the vertical shoot positioning. This forces the vine's shoots to grow upright along supported wires, and it then enables better movement in the vineyard of people, so through tractors, for example, for cultivation and for harvest. So greater uniformity and more sort of homogeneous note to the vineyards. And also, just to talk about the production of high yielding hybrids as well, the Soviets also planted high yielding grape varieties, including indigenous ones like Kangun and Hagtanak that we mentioned in the last video, and even new hybrids developed in research stations to boost the amount of crops produced here. Quality and diversity were sadly secondary to the main goal of quantity. Now, on the broad, flat expanses of the Ararat Valley, one could see vast vineyards pruned and trained in exact identical fashion. Lots of homogeneous vineyards in play, with a real sort of gear towards factory output production. Irrigation was introduced to push yields further as well. Open concrete channels would flood or furrow irrigate the rows. And even today, you'll find many vineyards still using these Soviet era methods. So surface irrigation and wider spacing rows. Now, only recently have progressive growers started to add drip irrigation to conserve water and to improve consistency. However, contemporary Armenian vintners are modifying these practices to produce quality. So any vineyards planted post 2000 will use trellises and modern pruning, but with an aim to control yields, to improve grape maturity rather than just to maximize output. Now, Armenia's best vineyards would employ the modern methods. So emphasis on low yield, sustainable practices, and aligning with the global viticultural standards. So this is important, certainly, for the modernization of Armenia to be recognized around the world. Winemaking side of things, a little bit on steel. So Armenian winemakers will face some key decisions, as all will in the world, for how you will ferment your wines. Now, in the past, we utilize the clay karas. We'll talk about that very soon in a couple of slides. But today, the real sort of workhorse vessel would be stainless steel, followed by barriques, so barrels. Stainless steel has become ubiquitous for really a good reason. The tanks are, of course, neutral, airtight, and they don't introduce any flavors of their own. So, if you want to express a grape variety or a specific terroir, it's a good idea to utilize the likes of stainless steel so you can protect that real focus of the grape variety, for example. A great example of that is Voshkovat, which is a grape variety with really charming aromatics, best protected in stainless steel. Temperature control in stainless steel as well is certainly crucial for preserving delicacy in fruit. And the newly reopened Enology Center in Voshkovat village, for instance, students train on modern stainless steel fermenters and lab equipment. So moving away from the old rustic karases of the past. But also oak barrels, I mentioned, it's important, essential for making complex and structured wines. Armenian wineries today use barrels made from lots of different species and origins. Mostly French and American, some Hungarian is used, and also Armenian oak for the local twist. Now, Armenian oak barrels can impart sweet spice like vanilla and clove, but also herbal notes, even like eucalyptus. Because the oak grows in a drier climate, it's considered more intense in effect than French oak. So winemakers will actually utilize it rather carefully. Now, if you want to get the oak effect, as in other places in the world, stainless steel would be used and oak chippings or staves would be added into it. But that will often be quite powerful. And some winemakers will employ a mix of vessels, karas, so the clay pots, barrels, and also stainless steel. That can often give more complexity or a layered approach to the wine. There's also concrete being used as well in Armenia, so concrete eggs and concrete. Now, there's a lot to talk about on these two slides, so bear with me, but it is fascinating, and that's talking about karas. So long before steel and oak, there was clay, from the ground. And the karas, as mentioned on your slide here, is the traditional Armenian amphora. Really, this was an absolute pillar, cornerstone of Armenian viticulture for thousands of years, and still today holds very big importance. It's a giant egg-shaped clay pot like you see on your picture, often somewhere between 400 litres to 1,200 litres large, so nearly as tall as a person for the most part. Now, these clay pots would be buried in the ground or up to their necks in the earthen floor of a cellar or in the ground outside. Now, this is important because that helps keep the fermentation temperature colder and the storage temperature constant using the earth's natural insulation, that inertia that you get. Now, archaeological excavations at the Armenian cave showed that around 6,000 years ago, people were using these karas here in Armenia to ferment grape juice into wine. Now, that's super important because this is really, really tangible historical wine production in play. And traditionally, a family in somewhat like Vayots Dzor or the Armenia province would crush their grapes, pour the must into karas, and let it ferment naturally with wild yeast, something which is being much more reclaimed in the last 20 years across the world. Now, the wide opening at the top would be covered, maybe with cloth or sealed with clay or wax. And the wine might be left aging on its lees for months or years. Typically about 40 days after primary fermentation, the karass would be sealed. So when it's fermenting in the karass, it's not sealed and all the carbon dioxide is given off. Once it finishes its ferment and all the skins start to drop to the bottom, they then will seal it. So sealed, the wine could last for years inside a well-sealed karass due to the cold anaerobic conditions. But once you open it, you need to drink up. Villagers knew that after tapping a karass, so opening it to taste it, would mean that you would start to oxidize inside. So they had about 2 weeks to finish it off before it went bad. And that's actually one of the reasons why a lot of karass traditionally are quite small. Of course, today we have lots of processes to help these wines age in bottle, the use of sulfur dioxide, for example. But you can imagine the scene in those old days, breaking that wax seal, the first to pour the wine out that's been sitting there, no testing during those years and years in karass, pouring out, tasting it to see if it's still good. Something that has happened in bygone ages, with things like, I don't know, things like Chateau Chalon, for example, down in Jura and other places in the world which have been sealed up for a long time, opened up and tasted to see if they're still good. So under the Soviet era, sadly, the tradition of karass was really eliminated, and you really see very limited amounts being produced at that time. The Soviets were all about mass production wine and mainly brandy production, as I've talked about before. So fewer people bothered with this production method. There were very little doing the karass, and collective farms, those big state farms, would use modern tanks and not the karass. And by the 1980s, many of the ancient karasses were simply just gathering dust in the corner of cellars, or they became ornaments, for example. And in some villages, you'll still find giant clay pots sitting idly on the side because they're literally too big to remove without smashing the wall or breaking the pot. It's quite poignant because these clay pots have survived invasions and earthquakes only to fall victim to political change in time. And by the 1990s, only a few of the older generation knew how to work with them, and nearly none were being made still in the area. So very much no knowledge being passed down. Kilns that would fire these karass will certainly fall silent. Armenia's neighbours, Georgia, managed to keep their clay winemaking tradition going, but it almost waned to a standstill there as well. So very, very hard to even get them today, the karass. But the karass revival in the past decade, so let's say in the past sort of 10 to 20 years, at the early start of the 21st century, Armenia's boutique wineries have certainly focused on rediscovering karass as they embrace their roots. So pioneers like Dzor Wines, for example, founded by Zorik Garebian, have made karass central to their philosophy, proving that ancient methods can yield great results. No new karasses are being made in Armenia, so wineries have gone to great lengths to acquire old ones. Dzor scoured villages to collect hundreds of abandoned karasai, and sometimes even knocking down basement walls to free them because the vessels are too large to get through the doors. So knocking the wall down and getting out of them. I think it was all by arrangement, not by theft. Trinity Canyon vineyards transported karasses from remote villages by donkey cart to avoid breakages. So only a few potters remember the techniques, and the proper karass clay firing is essentially a lost art in Armenia, which is very sad. Revival efforts are underway, and there are plans to establish a Karas making school to train new artisans to make them, a little bit like what Georgia has already done. And winemakers using Karases today do so to experiment with flavor and to celebrate Armenian heritage. Wines fermented in Karas can have great textural characteristics, somewhat like Georgian Kvevri, for example. But clay is hard to sanitize and can often harbor wild microbes, leading to funky aromas. So it's about storytelling, it's about authenticity. It's quite exciting. And I think we're going to see a shift, hopefully, to utilizing more of these as some start to get remade. Next up, we're going to be talking about the key wine regions and producers of Armenia. Once again, any comments or questions, please do get in touch. And you can do so by commenting on this video below. And if you're in the UK, come and say hello for a glass, or a bottle. Cheers and ciao for now. Goodbye.